I'm okay.
Okay.
Settle in. The recording is in progress, but no worries. You can feel free to have your camera on or off. Hold in. It's nice. So hi, everybody. Welcome to the space. We're gonna get started in just another minute or so. Let's keep it in. So I'm gonna get settled. We're probably ready to go. I don't know, Victoria, you want to do a slow played out? Hi, everybody. If you haven't seen the action happening in the chat, there was a request for y'all to introduce yourselves in the chat. Go ahead and tell us where you're calling from, any groups that you're affiliated with. We'd love to capture that information. In case you're wondering, am I in the right Zoom room? Am I in the Zoom room that I intended to be on? You are in the cost of convenience Zoom room. We are talking specifically about how e-commerce is rapidly changing our cities. A little housekeeping tip, we do actually expect to have quite a little bit of a bigger group today. And so if throughout the presentation you have any questions that you would really like for us to respond to, we ask that in your chat you go ahead and put question and then submit your question. That just makes it easier for us to track it and make sure that we have some space to actually respond to that. So with that, let's go on to the next slide and kind of introduce what are we doing here? Who are we? So we wanted to welcome you to this exciting collaboration. This is a webinar that's actually hosted by a few different groups. You'll hear from myself and my colleagues at STAND.earth, and you'll also hear from our friends at Sierra Club and Équiterre. But the host organization for this particular event is actually the Safe Cities program at STAND.earth. And in case you happen to wander into the Zoom space, but you don't know who Safe Cities is, Safe Cities is an organization, is a campaign internally at Stand.earth that recognizes how reliant our communities, particularly in North America, are on fossil fuel industry. We recognize that for far too long, the fossil fuel industry and has had an outsized amount of influence internally at City Hall. And we see that reflected in the way that our cities are shaped in the spaces that are available to communities. And sometimes that influence is really obvious. Say in the US, or particularly for myself in Los Angeles, it's the freeways, it's the gas stations, it's the refineries. But sometimes it's even more subtle. It could be things like the construction of our buildings, the lack of public transit, our dependence on cars for basic needs. For today's webinar, we're particularly going to be exploring the field of transportation sector, partially because we just have a new transportation policy menu that we'll be sharing with you in our follow-up emails. But as we wanted to talk about transportation, it became apparent that something is changing in the transportation sector, the rise of e-commerce. And in order for us to tackle that problem, we wanted to kind of leverage a variety of different pieces, including the local power that at Safe Cities we believe can help change the tide. So let's start by kind of going over the plan for today. Can we go to the next slide? Did the slide get stuck? Oh, there you go. So for today's agenda, we're going to start by talking a little bit about what e-commerce is, and particularly its relationship to climate. Then we'll be going over the ecosystem that really fuels this, so how all these different parts play into one another. We'll dive a little bit more specifically with our friends from the Sierra Club about the indirect source rule that governs air quality. We'll talk a little bit about municipal policies and local powers that we can potentially leverage in order to mitigate the impact that the e-commerce sector has had in our cities. And finally, we'll finish off by talking about our innovative corporate campaigning work, particularly the work of the Deliver Change campaign. And then lastly, we know that a lot of you are going to be really interested and curious to learn more about what you can do. So we'll have some space for that as well. All right, but let's get into the meat of it. Next slide. So, and for some reason the slides are a little bit blurry. Maybe we can change that. So I wanted to start with this slide mostly because I feel very nostalgic in some ways for the old days of Amazon.com, back when it was a used bookseller. I know when I was younger, that's what folks knew and were excited about Amazon in particular. And I love this slide not only because it's a little bit amusing to see, but also because it reminds us of there's a tendency to look at new technology as something that could potentially dramatically change our situation. But in reality, we live in a capitalistic society. And oftentimes, what can start off as a really interesting promise of convenience can have a whole host of unintended consequences. So obviously, this is no longer the Amazon.com that we know, but rather, next slide. Rather, it's now a multi-billion-dollar industries. And quite frankly, our cities, our infrastructure, and our workforces are really struggling to adequately regulate this rapidly growing industry. We know that Amazon in particular has become a behemoth. It has swallowed competitors. It has had an outsized influence in a lot of cities, both in the corporate sector, but also in the warehouse construction and our ports as well. And we also know that they're beginning to have an outsized impact in polluting our environment. So now we're looking at how can we figure out different leverage points in order for us to actually respond and rise to the occasion. Now, as for climate specifically, if we can move to the next slide. A few years ago, we actually commissioned a slide internally at STAND.earth. So STAND.earth actually does have a research component, and we commissioned this study called The Cost of Convenience in order to better articulate all of the different climate impacts associated with the e-commerce sectors. And I actually think it's rather important to kind of look and name explicitly of all these different findings. We found that the e-commerce sector, particularly after the pandemic, has had exponential growth. The study predicts a global annual parcel volume increase from over 350 billion parcels in 2022 to over 800 billion parcels over 2030. Um, Give me just one second. We also know that there's an outside health impact as well that is not evenly distributed. The delivery industry emits other pollutants, including nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and carbon monoxide. Communities of color and lower income communities are at greater risk due to increased exposure to transportation and warehouse pollution. And lastly, another thing that we documented through the study is that the company has a variety of internal shortfallings. As of now, less than 1% of deliveries in the US were made using EVs and other micromobility modes. That's information according to Amazon's own internal reportings. What's more, the subcontractor and gig work landscape across e-commerce is vast and extremely opaque, making it nearly impossible to hold companies accountable to their own environmental commitments. So we have a pretty big task ahead of us. And part of the reason we wanted to have you here is that we're trying to figure out how to untangle this deeply, deeply complex ecosystem and figure out what the different leverage points are for action. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the ecosystem overview and how these different parts play together. For many of us who've come accustomed to the packages just miraculously appearing on our doorstep, not far too often, we don't really give too much thought to how did that package arrive? What are the different logistical systems that had to happen in order for it to arrive? What are the different interests and shareholders that are involved? And what we found to be true across our campaigning is that we're most powerful when we don't get so narrowly focused on one specific policy to be able to solve for the whole problem. Rather, we need to find a variety of different leverage points that addresses the different impacts of the system. It also felt important to explicitly name that each of these different process points has a unique set of stakeholders, who we need to be engaging with consistently as we are crafting and developing these campaigns. So starting with, on the bottom left, the warehouses themselves and the ports that are often regulated, or sometimes the clearest mechanism for regulation are things like the indirect source rules. We know that the warehouses in port cities and the diesel trucks and the heavy duty trucking associated with that tends to affect more directly lower income neighborhoods, port cities, truck drivers, and the warehouse workers who are already at a lot of political disadvantage. Then we have some of the municipal policies that are often more related to what we call last mile delivery. And that all that refers to is sort of the final leg of the journey of the package from the warehouse to your home. We know that those unique stakeholders for that particular piece of the campaign is dense urban centers who tend to feel the impacts of increased amount of these mid journey vehicles at the greatest. And then lastly, we know that the system all just moves forward because there's money to be made. And there are corporate actors who are also deeply involved in this process, whether that be the corporate workers themselves, who are sort of creating the systems internally and sort of setting up these systems, as well as the Amazon's headquarters cities, where we know that Amazon has a disproportionate amount of influence on local politics, as well as corporate investors. And so we wanted to outline all these different pieces and how they all play together, partially so we can be more articulate and refined in sort of our theory of change about needing to address all these different pieces. But of course, we can only do this work in conjunction with other partners and together. So with that, we've invited some of our experts on the other pieces to join us for this conversation and kind of outline us through those different steps and what different levers are available for tackling this incredibly complex problem. So I will hand over the mic now. So we'll go to the next slide. We're moving forward in the agenda to go on to the indirect source role. And so without further ado, I yield my time to Yasi of Sierra Club.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. I'm loving all this activity. We got so many people from Canada, Bay Area, Southern California, Washington. This is so lovely to be here. I'm a field manager at Sierra Club National. I use she, her pronouns. And this photo right here is actually a bird's eye view from a community not too far from where I live on the border of Eastvale and Norco in Southern California in Riverside County. It's called Miraloma. And as you can see, we have millions of square feet boxed out or building big boxes of warehouses. So this is a really personal issue to me. I have been working around freights and goods movement since I was in college 11 years ago, seeing how public education and the goods movement sector were related. And Amazon is the largest private sector employer in my county. And we believe at Sierra Club that in order to hold corporations accountable like Amazon, I saw somebody mention other online companies like Temo or Timo, whatever they're called, other big box realtors, we need to have regulations to hold them to a high standard. In the United States, we have the Clean Air Act, and this isn't going to be a environmental law lecture. This is hopefully the last type of lecture you could ever get from indirect sources rules. But I highly encourage folks to understand this mechanism by doing your own research. So in the early 70s, or in the early 70s and all the way up to the 90s, there was a conversation on from the Clean Air Act at the federal level on how can we look at emissions from facilities that contribute to mobile sources that have construction equipment or other equipment that continue to emit pollution. And in Southern California, the population is about a third of the whole state that's affected by pollution from power plants. In this case, we're talking about warehouses, rail yards, ports, industry. So we have a huge air pollution problem here. And we've been organizing for 10 years to make sure that warehouses are accounted for under the Clean Air Act and under an indirect sources rule. We won that measure, even though it was sued by the industry. And we look forward to implementing the indirect sources rule on a federal level. So in the next slide, we can kind of go into how this can show up on a federal level for the United States. It could also show up on a statewide level. In New York right now, there is a huge effort to make sure that the environmental agencies there are looking at warehouses as a part of the e-commerce boom as an indirect sources rule. In Southern California, we did it through a regional air quality management district. This is something that not a lot of states have. Because of Southern California's terrible air pollution, we have a specific board that was started in the early 50s, way before the Clean Air Act, to look at air pollution. So this board has been a legacy in determining air pollution guidelines for the rest of the country. And not many people know about this board. So we adopted Sierra Club and many environmental justice partners that are doing the groundwork, like I was showing you in that picture, connecting with residents, connecting with people who live nearby and are affected by warehousing, increased truck traffics from their homes, last mile delivery vans, box trucks. We connected with on the ground populations across the Southern California region in the inland valleys and by the coastal ports in Los Angeles and Long Beach to pass a strong indirect sources rule that mandates electrification of their warehouses. So what does that mean? Infrastructure for cleaner trucks, solar on their warehouses, looking at cargo handling equipment that uses diesel on the daily. So we this is the first of its kind regulation. It passed in 2021. And like I mentioned before, the industries, the California Trucking Association and the Airlines Associations of America sued the Air Quality Management District. And they won a big lawsuit. The South Coast Air District won the big lawsuit to uphold the rule and regulation for a regional approach covering a third of California's population, the first of its kind. And yes, our new organizer for Sierra Club National, Bobby Joe, is on the line. So please keep putting in resources, Bobby Joe, to really explain our narrative. I'm going to keep it moving on what the indirect sources rule is. So if you can go to the next slide. So to get into the details of what we passed in Southern California, we made sure it applied to warehouses at minimum at 100,000 square feet. There's going to be a movement emerging to look at even smaller warehouses around 50,000 square feet. But as you've seen in the picture, many of our communities are dealing with millions of square footage of warehousing. So 100,000 square feet was a big win for us. There's about 3,000 warehouses that are covered in the rule. And the compliance for the rule has already began. In fact, some of the warehouses were waiting to see what was happening with the lawsuit. And I can chat in our statement later on so you all can kind of see, our celebratory statement. And we actually just missed the deadline, like the corporations that sued the Air District on the warehouse rule also missed the deadline to appeal right now. I just got news. Jacob, who's also here from our Bay Area chapter, and we were celebrating because they missed the deadline and they cannot appeal their lawsuit. So, which is really great. So the warehouse indirect sources rule in Southern California is definitely a mechanism to continue the fight for warehouse emissions reductions and ending pollutions everywhere. And that's what we believe. So the compliance reports are fascinating. If folks don't comply, they have to pay a mitigation fee, and that mitigation fee is mandated to go locally nearby the warehouses that paid the fee. We weren't happy about there being a fee. We wanted to see something that could like close the facility down if they didn't comply, but we settled on a mitigation fee, which is, I believe, $1,500 or $2,000 per square foot. So it's a pretty sizable amount of money if you're thinking about, millions of square feet. And that's how the compliance is also calculated based off the square feet. And then, so how will warehouses comply? There's a menu of options. So like I said, they can go through an electrification process where they're applying to be a part of the WARE program, Warehouse Actions and Investment Requirements, reduction in emissions requirements program. Sorry, so many acronyms today. And definitely we're seeing a huge buy-in from warehouses, even though this rule just barely passed in 2020, mid 2021, and we're seeing warehouses go into compliance. It could be better, but we're excited to see the implementation of this rule play out. And we're also excited to push the federal government to come up with a framework looking at warehouse and e-commerce, as many communities are growing into becoming inland ports or seeing major warehousing. I'm sure many of you are here today because you're worried about warehousing growth in your community. So this rule is one piece of action you can take to stop the growth of warehousing. So, and I believe I will pass it back to Michelle to introduce our next speaker. And I'm going to stick around and be able to share more resources. Definitely wanted to introduce the concept today, but happy to help down the line.
Thank you for that, Yasi. I think I will unconventionally field one of the questions since it's related to your slides. There was a question in the chat about fines associated with not being in compliance. Do you know what happens to those fines?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's right now it's in progress. And so there's two things. So first, it's supposed to go to the Air Quality Management District, the agency responsible for enforcing the rule, is collecting the fines, and it's mandated to be spent in zero emission infrastructure, clean energy built out, anything that takes fossil fuels off the road and off the facility itself. So and it's also mandated to be spent locally. Another piece that's actually really interesting that I did not address is that we worked with the local electrical union, that local IBW 11, on ensuring that those fees are also spent with apprenticeship programs in mind, with local hire, with either also like in partnership with universities to see how students from those communities can be building out the future of infrastructure. So those fees are, we worked really hard to negotiate that those fees stay local.
I was gonna say, from everything you said, I was like, I bet y'all were behind that. I was like, that doesn't sound like something they would just give.
We were behind like 80% of the rule, because if the environmentalists in the room and environmental justice partners were in the room, industry would have just been like, we don't need this rule. And so it's really important to stay active and in spaces that I call them dry and dusty spaces, like the South Coast AQMD or your local cities, on what their standards are for implementing, innovative rules for zero emissions, and holding these corporations accountable on how they're building out their future in your city.
Thank you for that, Yasi. All right, so we can kind of move forward. So that we've tackled a little bit of the indirect source rule, particularly as it relates to some of the warehouse construction, but we're also eager to hear about some of the innovative municipal strategies that have arisen, particularly from our friends in Montreal in Canada. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce Andriane from Équiterre and have her walk us through some of their findings.
Thank you, Michelle. Good evening, everyone. Bonjour. So I am Andréane Brazo. I'm a climate policy analyst with Équiterre. So it's one of the most important environmental organizations in Canada. And I'll just say that we celebrated our 30th anniversary last year. So we work on 4 key topics, which are transportation, of course, but also climate and energy, sustainable food systems, and consumption of goods, or deconsumption, as we call it internally. My first language is French, and here it's starting to be quite late in the day, so sorry about my English in the next couple of minutes. So the initiative that we did in Montreal took place from spring 2020, so right after the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, until the fall 2021. And it really focused on the increase in online commerce as well. But the fact that the pandemic happened made our project all the more relevant back then. And so the other pieces of context are that, well, in 2020, the City of Montreal announced a very ambitious climate plan, which aims to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030. And we know that, well, the vast majority of emissions are from the transport sector. So it really aligned with the fact that there were more trucks circulating in our city. And that, well, freight emissions were and are still supposed to surpass those of passenger vehicles by 2030. So what we wanted to do was to really foster action, because what we noticed was that there was a lot of, well, the municipal officials with whom we talked did not really have the keys to face the issue. So we wanted to foster action on their end, and we also wanted to inform and support professionals from different sectors, including urban planners and public policy professionals, when it comes to designing policies and programs that would accelerate the adoption of smart and sustainable practices in urban freight. So what we did over more than a year was, before I go into that, I'll just say that we partnered with the Pembina Institute, which is also a major think tank in Canada, and with Jalon, a local organization that worked on sustainable logistics for transportation. And they had already in the past identified solutions for decarbonizing urban freight. So we built and explored, we built on that work and explored some of those solutions and see which ones were more applicable to Montreal. So that was really the basis of our work. And so from there, we did a literature review of the best practices when it comes to sustainable urban freight from around the world. We also set up an advisory board, which was really key because we had representatives from the Quebec government, but also from the federal government, from the city of Montreal too, and from various departments as well. So not just urban planning, but also economic development within the city and even ecological transition as well. These people do not always speak to each other, as you probably know. So having them around the same table throughout the entire project and not just at the end when it was time to show them the results was really I think was a good thing that we did. It brought very interesting discussions and we were able to adjust and make sure that our process was relevant to them. So we also did over 50 interviews with all types of people who do urban freight in the city. So whether it's a small restaurant or the Association of Trucking of Quebec, or like all kinds of actors, furniture stores, etc. So there really was a bunch of them, and I think they are listed in the report, if I'm not mistaken. So that was quite a long process, but it really gave us a lot of information. We also went and talked to other cities. We talked to the city of Paris and other cities in Europe. We did policy analysis, and all of that led us to the report that was shared in the chat. So the toolbox that we like to call it, which has solutions that are adapted to Montreal. And then we, of course, continued disseminating the report to everyone relevant, to all the relevant stakeholders. We also we were also able to pull out guiding principles, which I think are applicable to pretty much every city, things that need to be kept in mind when thinking about those issues. This content starts at page 20 in the report. A lot of the content we have is in French, but I think we did a good job of putting the key information in English. So I hope it's useful to you. And there's also the implementation strategy elements that are also relevant to the work that Safe Cities is doing. In any case, so all of this to say that I think we can go back to the other slide, the previous slide. So we were able to identify 4 solutions, and in the report, we really explain what should be done policy-wise at the municipal, provincial, and federal level. These are, of course, adapted to the Quebec context, so might not always be applicable, but all the arguments for certain solutions are really detailed. It really is in order, so the first one should be the priority, and the last one is for when the other solutions are not applicable. In order to reduce the number of trucks circulating in the city. That really is the end goal. One of the end goals that we took was also that we needed to take into account the social aspect. So creating a safer city that doesn't have as many vehicles, not just for the climate and environmental side, but also for the safety side. Well, I'll just finish by saying that, I'll stop here, but I'm happy to take questions for anything else. It's a project that we did a long time ago, so sorry if that was a bit messy.
No worries, no worries. That was extremely helpful. Yeah, as folks are interested in diving in a little bit more into the details, we've actually linked to the report in the chat, so you can go ahead and open that up. And then, of course, if you have any questions, continue to put them in the chat and we can ask them towards the end. But thank you, Andrian. Okay, so the second part. So we've discussed the first part about indirect source rule that targets a lot of the warehouse pieces. We spent some time talking about what is known internally as the last mile delivery. So really just the final move from the warehouses to the porches, which tends to be particularly difficult to navigate in dense urban centers. And now we wanted to move to talking about sort of the corporate actors and the role of corporate campaigning. I think a few of you have probably heard us allude to the fact that like we're talking quite a bit about Amazon, but clearly they're not the only e-commerce business that exists out there. But there's this reason and a strategy behind why we're talking about Amazon specifically. And so with that, I will hand it over to my colleague at STAND.earth, Josh, to talk a little bit about the Deliver Change campaign.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your afternoons and evenings to join us in this discussion. I am Josh, a campaigner at STAND.earth, and I come from the corporate campaigning space. So what gets me excited is opportunities to defend communities and make climate progress by encouraging companies to take action or to compel them when necessary. So I was very excited to join the campaign, to join the Clean Mobility Collective and to be a part of our work to make Amazon deliver change. Policies and regulations like those we've been talking about today are one lever that we can pull in this space. But holding companies accountable is another lever. So talk a little bit about why Amazon. Next slide. When we talk about Amazon in the broader e-commerce sector, we're talking about a very unique company in a few different ways. One of those ways is that Amazon is so big that it's impacting so many aspects of our society and our economy for its benefit. In addition to its direct lobbying on policies like those we've been talking about today, the company is also a bellwether for the industry. So where Amazon goes, the rest of the industry follows. As a campaign, we have an opportunity not just to influence Amazon to move toward decarbonizing its fleet, but to influence the broader industry toward climate and environmental justice. Amazon is unique in its size. It's the second largest company in the world by revenue and the third largest polluter in the e-commerce industry, following UPS and FedEx. And that's just focusing on the last mile sector. And here's the kicker. Amazon knows it has a pollution problem. The company demonstrated as much when it quietly eliminated its shipment zero commitment. And that was a promise to make half of its shipments net zero by 2030. That promise has disappeared. The company has made commitments and pledges to electrify its fleet, but without improved transparency on what its overall fleet size even is, it's difficult to know if those commitments mean anything at all. So Amazon's current position on climate and environmental justice is insufficient in its and weak. And it has a tremendous impact on so many other pieces of the e-commerce puzzle. I want to zoom in just a little bit on those commitments as well. So if we move to the next slide, what this graph is demonstrating, and these are all from the cost of convenience report that Michelle referenced earlier in the call. But this graph demonstrates Amazon's current fleet commitments as well as a projected shortfall based on our best estimates of parcel volume growth. Let's break that down just a little bit. Amazon's fleet commitments are represented by the blue and green segments of this graph. What you can see here is that Amazon has made commitments to acquire new EV vehicles as part of its fleet, but they barely dent the absolute volume of fossil fuel vehicles that Amazon plans to continue operating. Furthermore, these commitments, the section at the top represented in red is what we think the actual fleet volume might grow to based on projections of parcel volume growth. So growth in how many deliveries are being made. This is because of the lack of transparency in Amazon's reporting, and because the company hasn't made clear commitments to decarbonize its fleet. At best, this is a conservative graph. The situation could be much worse. And that would be a disaster for communities in sacrifice zones and for our progress on the climate crisis. So just a little bit on the impact. Again, Michelle referenced this earlier, but more trucks on the road, obviously, means more carbon in the atmosphere and worsening climate change. The emissions from these trucks also include a lot of really messy pollutants that contribute to more incidents of respiratory illness, more asthma, and a number of other really, really tragic problems. So it's something that we need to address. It's something that the policies and regulations we're discussing will help us address, but we also want to put pressure on Amazon. Next slide. That's why in May of last year, we launched a campaign to make Amazon move to zero emission deliveries by 2030. Our campaign is using a combination of tactics that include public actions, impactful and research-backed messaging, and direct negotiation with Amazon leaders. And we've reached out to Amazon leaders to talk with us about what they need to do to be accountable. But so far we've gotten crickets. And that's one of the reasons that we need more people to lend their voice to this campaign. So in a moment, I'm going to offer you some very concrete ways that you can engage in the work that we're doing to make Amazon deliver change. Before we do that, I want to share just one little snippet from some of what we've been up to in the past year. So we're going to move on to a video, and hopefully it moves smoothly and beautifully.
You will require 1 minute of patience while we get it all queued up. Should be here shortly. And just a reminder, if you have questions, continue to drop them in the chat. We are collecting them, and we'll have some space towards the end to answer.
Amazon! Deliver change! 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 Amazon! Deliver change!
We're here at Seattle's Pike Place Market and the Space Needle asking people about Amazon's air and climate pollution.
Amazon is poisoning our climate and communities with tons of pollution.
From giant fossil-fueled ships and thousands of delivery vans.
Let's see what people think.
Did you know that Amazon is a prime polluter that's been poisoning our climate and communities?
No, I did not.
I did not.
No, I was not aware of that.
Actually, it's my first time to know that.
I did not know, but I'm learning this today.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely something I've heard about.
Yeah.
You're coming all the way from Scotland?
Yes.
Long flight. Did you know that Amazon is poisoning our environment with tons of pollution from giant fossil-fueled ships and delivery vans?
I knew about the delivery vans, but I wasn't sure about the ships. Never even thought about that.
Did you know that Amazon is a prime polluter that is poisoning our climate and communities with fossil fuels from their ships and vans?
I did not know that, and I use Amazon quite a bit.
How does it make you feel to learn that this massive Seattle-based corporation is polluting and not taking any drastic action to address it?
I don't feel real happy about it. I didn't know that, and I'm glad you guys informed me of that.
Sad that we're not making the planet a better place.
I think that's a terrible thing, and I think, they're so worldwide now and responsible for so much commerce that they could at least be taking care of the environment.
This should be a wake-up call, because the climate really is changing.
Amazon deliver change. It makes me feel pretty bad because, it's a pretty place, and I love it, so I don't want it to be ruined.
Do you think that Amazon should commit to 100% zero-emission shipping and delivery by 2030?
Yes, it would be good.
They've done amazing things in the past, and they can do this too.
Most definitely. Electric vehicles are the way to go. I'm in one right now.
Awesome.
You know?
We have to make the effort. Not doing something because you don't have a perfect plan is not an answer.
If you could say something to Amazon CEO Andy Jassy, like what would you tell him?
Their corporation has a huge effect on the world, and to think about the decisions that they're making and how it affects the people of the world too, not just the profits that they're getting. Amazon, deliver change.
Will you share what you learned today with your friends, family, neighbors?
I definitely will.
Yeah, I definitely will too. They need to do something.
Amazon, deliver change.
Y'all better be careful with Amazon. Matter of fact, I think I'm gonna cut back on some of my deliveries with those guys.
Yeah, we gotta make them change.
Yeah, I mean, come on. Amazon, deliver change, man.
Amazon, deliver change.
I'll do it for you. I got an electric vehicle. Huh? Huh?
Thank you, guys.
The controversy around Amazon's air and climate pollution is growing.
Sign the petition at STAND.earth/prime polluter.
Mr. Jassy, we want zero emission shipping by 2030.
Amazon, commit to 100% zero emissions, first and last mile delivery by 2030.
Amazon, deliver change. Amazon, deliver change. Amazon, deliver change. Amazon, deliver change.
Isn't that something? I've seen that video a number of times being a part of this campaign, and I still get a little teary-eyed every time I see it. Those young kids who turned out for that are so great. And we've been helped in this campaign by a number of other people, partners in the CMC network, many on this call, Athena and many others, too many to name, because Amazon's inaction is costing all of us, and that's unacceptable. So there are a couple of ways that you can get engaged today. The video we just shared is on YouTube and across our socials, and we love showing to Amazon leadership that people are getting the message. So if you can watch that, like it, share it around, and help get the word out that Amazon's deliveries are creating a tremendous impact on our society and our economy. We also have a letter to Amazon's CEO, Andy Jassy, that's linked, well, in these slides, but I think we can also put a link in the chat. And we're upping our ambition in the year ahead, so please do stay tuned, and we'll give you many more opportunities to be a part of our campaign to make Amazon deliver change. I think that's all from me. Back to you, Michelle.
Yeah, one more thing that I will mention about the Amazon campaign. So a lot of this conversation has primarily been focused on North America, but I suspect that we might have a few folks who are actually calling in internationally. And the Amazon campaign is actually part of a broader international effort through the Clean Mobility Collective, which is I guess a network of different organizations all across the world who are trying to also tackle this problem. And so if you want to follow us more, it'd be exciting for you to learn a little bit more about what our international partners are doing as well on this move, because in order to tackle a global empire, you need a global amount of folks all over the place. We also recommend, if you're interested in staying engaged with us throughout this process, we will be sending information about how to join the Safe Cities Organizing Network. You can also, right now, if you feel so compelled, go to stand.earth /safe organizing, or you can also email myself or Josh. Our emails are listed on this slide to learn more about how you can become more involved. So if you feel particularly engaged and want to tackle this, we are looking for folks who are ready to step up and really lead campaigns locally. That's my little pitch to y'all, but without further ado, I know there's been quite a few questions that have kind of been coming through the chat, and we wanted to take some time to go ahead and answer that. So we can take off the slideshow and maybe spotlight some of the other speakers. Fantastic. Ariane, I see that your hand's up. Did you have a question?
Yes, thank you for taking my question first, and it's an important one. I very much appreciate your efforts trying to get people to start curbing and Amazon, which is really threatening much more than we know. But what I'm concerned is being left out of the dialogue is the fact that we need to be pursuing degrowth. So it's not enough just to have people use electric vehicles to deliver individualized parcels to people's doors. Americans or US residents are 4% of the world's population, and we use 25% of all the resources. Clearly, that is unjust. And that is at the heart of what's happening with our climate catastrophe. And this global heating and climate disruption is entangled with a lot of different vectors. But the fact that Americans can so easily access things and without realizing what the human cost, what the environmental cost is, it's not just about transportation. It's like, for instance, when people used to hunt, they would see that the life of the animal in front of them expiring. And now people eat a lot of meat and they don't understand what that means either, maybe to their own health or to, the environment. Well, something similar is happening here. And Americans are actually, we're just really not aware of how addicted we are to our things. So I just would hope that you would include more of that in your campaign, because it's not enough to just deal with the symptoms. We have to deal with the cause.
I appreciate those sentiments, and I would love to have an offline conversation a little bit more about that, because I know it's something that I personally feel very strongly about, and it's interesting to kind of figure out how do we factor in the reality that, like, depending on where you live and depending on the resources available, that will depend on how much consumption folks are used to, and those are not distributed equally across the world. And so for me personally, that's what's sort of exciting about engaging on this campaign is as citizens of like a more prosperous country that have benefited from a lot of extractive industries, there's kind of that question of like, can we hold these corporations that we benefited from the money that's flooding our cities, can we hold them accountable, recognizing the implications that they're having in the global south on, continuing to extract resources. So definitely conversation to continue having. Is anybody else on the speakers wanted to respond at all?
Well, I guess I wanted to say that we for Équiterre, it's a really important topic. Consuming less stuff, buying less stuff, reusing stuff is important, and all of that. So we really, when we developed our project, we intentionally removed it from our methodology, because that would have entailed too many things to consider, and we wanted to focus on, let's say that consumption habits stay the same. What can we do? But of course, that doesn't exclude everything else that we can do before using the 4 solutions that we've identified, which is a whole, which is basically a whole other strategy and a whole other way of thinking. So like we limited it, but we also think it's very important.
Yeah, I can just add, so today I'm talking to you from Sierra Club National, and I represent campaigns that are very specific. So we're looking at tailpipe emissions and how they're affecting communities' health and the climate's health. But absolutely, degrowth is on the table. Many of our chapters are involved in how the land is used and how we make sure communities are educated on a local level on what they can do to stay local, to grow food local, to educate themselves about, like you were mentioning, reducing meat. So it's going to take a combination of conversations of, limiting our impacts individually and on the growth side, and then also holding corporations to a higher standard through regulation, because unfortunately, even though they might, find themselves growing less, like for example, with the warehouse indirect sources rule, it was projected that 6 warehouses would be built less every single year. It was some weird statistical projection the Air District did, but that doesn't mean that's going to affect another community. So when we're looking at our space in the United States, even though we may throw less or use less, we're still part of a hegemony in the world. And I think that's why the Clean Mobility Collective is in its nascent stage right now, but we're looking at a global perspective on how goods movement, how behavior change can reflect globally with countries in the global South as well. Just naming that. And then I also think like using the word degrowth is a great start, but I think we can also try to figure out how you can organize locally on actions. For example, many of Sierra Club in Southern California, alongside our environmental justice partners, hold events where we have free markets or uplift local artists and local makers on things that we need around our house, or exchanges on resources. So I think a lot of these actions can happen locally on being mindful of how we're growing and using resources as well. And please get involved if you have a
Yeah. Can I just quickly respond to that? So the major one resource issue is not only the manufacture of things that we don't really need, but it's the boxes. And so all those one-time deliveries, many people do not do recycling. And so that's one of the most serious issues in terms of raising our forests, the demonization and development of coveted land in rural and city areas, and the clear cutting of forests in both by the states and the U.S. government as they partner with the timber industry, and while they claim that they're doing wildfire abatement. So we cannot afford the paper boxes. And I think there should be, in terms of regulation, there should be a stiff tax on every box that comes out of Amazon. And that would be something working for right there. So I encourage you to consider that.
Yeah, and I think I will note also that, we're very cognizant too of sort of the levers that we can pull here. And so we know that sort of by focusing on the transportation angle and some of these regulatory agencies, it's a space that's not like there are other folks that are working on some of the more recycling related pieces of it. And so we're just kind of cognizant of the role that we play. I think the last thing I will say on this topic, in case folks are, maybe this is novel to you, maybe you've never heard of sort of this angle about talking about consumption, I'm more than happy to share resources that I've been able to see from environmental justice partners, as well as Indigenous partners, quite frankly, who've been really good about speaking about being in right relationship with the world and how that's actually deeply related to kind of having a conversation about like how much stuff do I need and what materials do I need. I have found those conversations to be like super helpful and enlightening. I also kind of want to quickly address that there's a little bit of I'll call it a little bit of a spicy conversation happening in the chat related to overpopulation. I want to note that I think that is actually a rather thorny conversation that is a little bit tricky to have within the context of a chat room. But it is a little bit like, if I had to quickly sort of define sort of our statement on it, we really want to focus on systemic issues that are related to sort of the corporations and governments that haven't been able to address the needs of the people, rather than kind of focusing too much on like shaming or judging any particular population. Because I think I saw really briefly that somebody put on there that part of it is sort of the imbalances that already exist in our society that have kind of led us to the situation. But I will say I am more than happy, and I will offer myself if folks want to have that individual conversation, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is listed on the slides. We had some other questions that I don't want to lose sight of. I know we only have about 4 minutes left. There was a question for Andrian related to the policies. Are safe bike and roll routes and low traffic neighborhoods, traffic calm neighborhoods part of the freight recommendations of your report?
Yes, they are, especially in relation to the e-bike part. Well, we already have a very progressive administration that is developing hundreds of kilometers of bike lanes all over the city and making sure that they are all ready to be used at any season, and in winter it's a challenge here. So that's one thing that's been really that's moving quite smoothly in Quebec, in Montreal, not in Quebec, in Montreal. And it's important because it's really not going well for the rest of the province. And in terms of the slower city streets, that's also been progressing quite nicely in Montreal, and it's in the report, but it's less major. I think it was a bit less of because we wanted to put the focus on reducing the number of trucks, while of course, yes, trucks, if they are slower, are safer and are risking less lives, which is important, but it was also more about reducing the number of them. So it might be less prominent in the report.
Thank you. And I think one final question to sort of wrap us up. Well, should I do a little bit more general question? Maybe I'll say, is there any final words that folks from our speakers wanted to share as we kind of close out this space? Any final reflections?
I think it's wonderful you all are here and spending your time with us. Thank you so much. Please get involved, track how goods movement is showing up in your community. Reach out to any of us here to understand the technical pieces of it, but at the end of the day, it's going to need a culture shift, like we were talking about earlier. So supporting all of those efforts, and thank you for your time. Hope you feel inspired to shift the culture around e-commerce and holding Amazon and other corporations to a high standard.
Josh and Andrian.
Did you want to go first, Josh? I spoke a little bit more.
Sure, I would just echo what Yassi said. I've been in this space for a while, and it can be sometimes very motivating, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to think about all of the ways that big companies like Amazon are shaping our lives. And I'm inspired when I get to hang out with 60 people or whatever who care about this, and I'm reminded of the importance to remain engaged and the power that we hold when we come together and get educated about the policy and regulatory levers we can pull, the campaigning and action levers that we can pull. And so very encouraged by our discussion today, and thank you again to everyone who was able to join.
And I'll just add to that, well, working together is obviously the key. And I think it's the initiatives that we saw tonight are really inspiring. I work in Quebec, and there isn't always as much collaboration and as much dialogue on different issues between provinces, but also between countries, between the US and Canada. And seeing this right now, I think is really inspiring for what's next, because the fight is far from over.
And I guess I get to have the final word, and I'll just say, I think sometimes as environmentalists, we're like really into our little lanes and we know this issue in and out. But I think back about where I was when I was a 13-year-old in Los Angeles. I had no idea how things moved in the world. All I knew is that there were diesel trucks nearby, and sometimes people had asthma flare-ups. So I think if there's more of an opportunity to practice the skill of like explaining, like, there's this massive sector and here's all the things they do and here's how they cut corners and here's some potential like real tangible levers for us to push back, that's really exciting. And it's exciting to do that on a Wednesday afternoon with 60+ people. So with that, thank you all so much for this. If you are registered for the webinar, which you are because you're here, you'll get a recording as well as the resources we mentioned on there. And both myself and Josh are more than happy to touch base if you wanted to ask any more questions. And you can also reach out to the speakers, who I think have graciously dropped their contact information as well. All right, y'all, have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.